After talking a bit about unsuccessful fantasy franchises, watching a lot of one-off movies that set up a whole ton of plot points for future movies that end up going absolutely nowhere, I wanted to change things up a bit and actually watch things that have a complete story from beginning to end and actually enjoy myself. Because naturally, since the movies on this list are all complete, they tend to be on the better side of things. Tend to be. I didn't say they were. There's also a lot of stuff on this list that I've covered in separate videos on this channel, or stuff that I'm planning on making videos about soon, so I'm not going to go super into detail on each and every franchise. Instead, I'm going to be going in order of the least successful of these franchises to the most successful, in terms of money, how popular each franchise has remained through the years, and its impact on pop culture as a whole. There were some clarifications to be made when I was actually making this list. What is a fantasy franchise? Because in the last video I made, a whole lot of people complained that a lot of the movies or entries weren't actually fantasy, they were sci-fi, which was a pretty valid criticism. So fantasy, as I'm defining it, is magic, other worlds, supernatural creatures, or anything that has a sword in it. I think you'll find that all of the entries on this list have one or more of these components. So now that that's all cleared up, let's get right into 8 of the most successful fantasy franchises and where they are now. Starting off this list of successful franchises feels only right to start off with the least successful of the successful franchises, and that's Underworld. Vampires, gothic architecture, Kate Beckinsale, and also guns? The Underworld movies follow Celine as a vampire warrior. She navigates a very gothic world that also happens to be the backdrop between a vampire and werewolf war. She meets and falls in love with the human Michael, and through 5 movies we follow her adventures and also a prequel centering on the start of the werewolf and vampire feud. The Underworld movies have always had a very special place in my heart. These were some of the first R-rated movies I ever watched. I think these movies, along with Van Helsing and Prisoner of Azkaban, are the reasons why I love werewolves and also vampires so much. These are still some movies that I turn to for a rewatch at least once a year. Yeah, I see how cheesy they are now, and I can see why they aren't on the top of people's favorite vampire or werewolves, but they clearly did well because they're on this list, and there were 5 movies. This is very much a case of audience versus critics, because the average audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is a 65%, brought down by a lot because of the last film of the series, Blood Wars, and the average critic score is a mere 25%. The highest grossing film in the series is actually the 4th film, Underworld Awakening, making $160 million worldwide, while the lowest grossing film is the 5th film, making only $81 million worldwide. The series as a whole has made $542 million worldwide, didn't win any major awards or accolades, but considering the box office of the last film, the series' future is definitely in doubt. Which is pretty unfortunate, because I think the DNA of this series could actually work perfectly for a modern film. There's just enough horror and action to balance each other out, and with both horror and action films in recent years making a pretty big comeback, I think that a sort of soft reboot of this series could work out well. Imagine a John Wick-style action movie, but going against werewolves and vampires. That sounds pretty cool to me, and I think in the right hands, the Underworld series could have a bright future. Keeping in the realm of vampires and werewolves, let's talk about everybody's favorite franchise on this list, the Twilight Saga. The Twilight Saga follows Bella Swan in the small town of Forks, Washington, where she meets Edward Cullen and his family of vampires. Edward and Bella strike up a romance, and then she strikes up another romance with Jacob, who's a werewolf, and surprise surprise, the werewolves and vampires don't like each other here either. To be quite honest with you all, I have quite a history with the Twilight movies. For one, they're my girlfriend's favorite movies, so I've seen them more than a lot of the other movies on this list, but I also was kind of suckered into these movies when they were first coming out too, because growing up in a household of only women, I was dragged to these movies, and the promise of werewolves and vampires fighting did ultimately keep me engaged enough to see the movies out to the end, and I honestly, when they were first coming out, I didn't think they were that bad. I have a lot of thoughts on these movies, some good, some bad, but I think I'll save those for another video. Whether you like it or not, Twilight was an incredibly successful franchise, making over $3.3 billion at the box office. Although these movies didn't receive any awards or even critical or audience praise, they still made a ton of money, and I suspect any other delves into this franchise will probably also make a ton of money. But luckily for a lot of you, there aren't any spin-offs in the works. But unluckily for a lot of you, there's been a lot of talks about a Twilight reboot into a TV show. I think it's in the very early stages. There's no studio, writers, directors, or even cast attached. But if they can remake Harry Potter, they can and most certainly will remake Twilight.
Are you coming to the tree?
Next up, we're going to move away from the supernatural side of things and talk about The Hunger Games. Now, I know what you're thinking. Thrifty, Hunger Games isn't really fantasy, but I want to remind you of the criteria in the beginning of the video. If there's a sword, then it counts, and there most definitely is a sword in The Hunger Games. This also ties into this all mostly being like a young adult list, and I could have added Maze Runner in here as well, but since Hunger Games is the most popular and the most successful, I figured I had to put it on the list of successful franchises. The Hunger Games follows Katniss Everdeen as she volunteers to enter the Hunger Games, a reality TV-style entertainment for the citizens of Panem, as they watch 24 teenagers go head-to-head in an ultimate battle to the death. So I've actually already made a video on the Hunger Games, as well as Maze Runner and Divergent, so if you want to see more in-depth of my thoughts, go check that one out, but the too long didn't read version is this. The first Hunger Games movie is pretty good. Catching Fire is a phenomenal movie and is easily the best of the series, and Mockingjay Parts 1 and 2 isn't great. That's not really a fault of the movie because the Mockingjay book also kind of sucked, but after making that video and stating that opinion, a lot of people came to those movies' defense, talking about how it was a realistic depiction of a revolution, and I get all that, but it doesn't change the fact that the plot of the movie is just absolutely boring. And it did not need to be split into two movies. Same goes for Twilight, for that matter. But The Hunger Games was also incredibly successful, just as successful as Twilight, in fact, because they both made $3.3 billion worldwide. The series is also strange, because the box office and reception of the films actually perfectly mirrors my own thoughts. Catching Fire did the best critically and financially, and Mockingjay Part 2 did the worst, outside of that new prequel, which I still haven't seen, but that one actually did the worst financially. Coming up, there's yet another prequel centering on Haymitch's time in the Hunger Games, which actually sounds very interesting, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Follow me through the wardrobe as we talk about yet another franchise I've talked about on the channel, and that's the Chronicles of Narnia. Narnia follows the Pevensey children and their adventures in the magical world of Narnia, becoming kings and queens, fighting off different armies of creatures and humans, and traversing the seas in the Dawn Treader. Narnia was always kind of the black sheep of fantasy movies in the early 2000s, especially in comparison to the next couple entries on this list, but it still definitely had its time to shine. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the first movie on this list that actually won an Oscar. So good for Narnia, good for the first movie, but personally, I always favored the second film in the series, Prince Caspian. The third film, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, was okay, but it definitely was like an afterthought because Disney didn't even make it. Well, I suppose now they did, since they own 20th Century Fox, but back when it was made, they weren't responsible for it. Funnily enough, Voyage of the Dawn Treader actually did slightly better than Prince Caspian, making $418 million worldwide to Prince Caspian's mere $417 million. But really, only the first movie of the series did anything notable, making $720 million, bringing the total of the franchise to $1.5 billion and one Oscar. It's been confirmed that Netflix and Greta Gerwig are teaming up to make a new Narnia movie and series, most likely a reboot with a fresh take, so do with that information what you will. It's been described as pure rock and roll, which I don't even know what that means, but I guess we'll see how it turns out. Here we are to talk about yet another series that I've covered extensively on the channel, and that's Pirates of the Caribbean. Sword fights, magic, supernatural creatures, all on the backdrop with pirates as the main characters, made this series stand out to most other fantasy franchises of the 2000s. For those that don't know, Pirates of the Caribbean was actually based on the Disney World ride of the same name, and since this was such a success, they've tried doing that with a number of other titles. But Pirates of the Caribbean had major success due to one man, and that's of course Johnny Depp. Jack Sparrow is, I'd say, the most famous pirate of all time. Whether that makes him the best or worst pirate, well, that's up to you. Personally, I think that Pirates is a series with a lot of highs and lows. I think that Curse of the Black Pearl is a straight up 10 out of 10 movie. Dead Man's Chest and At World's End have some really great moments, but are also slow and poorly paced. On Stranger Tides is supremely underrated, and I'll die on that hill. And Dead Men Tell No Tales is just straight up garbage. However, the declining ratings of the series don't match how successful this franchise really was. With the highest grossing film, Dead Man's Chest, making over $1 billion on its own, and the least successful movie, Dead Men Tell No Tales, grossing more than the most successful Narnia movie and the entire Underworld franchise, this series made a whopping $4.5 billion at the box office. It also walked away with 10 Oscar nominations and 1 win for Best Visual Effects on Dead Man's Chest, which, if you compared it to most movies nowadays, I still feel like Dead Man's Chest would win. There have been rumors for a long time about a 6th entry in the Pirates franchise, some point to Margot Robbie being cast in the lead, and recently I've seen a bunch of rumors about Johnny Depp and Orlando Bloom returning, which sounds a bit off to me, but who knows, maybe Disney does want to pay Johnny $300 million and 1 million alpacas. Now, we're going to switch it up and talk about a franchise that I haven't covered yet. Harry Potter. Boy oh boy, where do I start with Harry Potter? For those that aren't aware, Harry Potter follows a young wizard boy and his pals at the magical school of Hogwarts, where they get into a ton of trouble. Some bald guy from Harry's past tries to kill him in the spring of every year because he still values Harry's year-long education, and he ultimately ends up failing every time. So Harry Potter isn't a topic I've talked about a lot on this channel, mostly because I'm not really sure how to make a video or videos on this topic, because I am the world's biggest Harry Potter fan. If I had to go to some trivia show because my life depended on it, you know, we all get in those situations, I would do trivia on Harry Potter. I think I've outwatched and outread probably every single person watching this video, and I will say that confidently, because Harry Potter is my favorite story of all time. With all that said, I will be making 2 separate videos on Harry Potter this year, so keep your eyes out for those. And if you don't like Harry Potter or have never seen them, then still keep your eye out for those videos, because I've got something special planned for them. Now, Harry Potter was once the highest grossing franchise of all time. Although it held that title very briefly, it did so for good reason. When people talk about capturing lightning in a bottle, I really think Harry Potter describes that perfectly. You had all these legendary British actors playing such relatively small roles throughout each and every film, had a new film every year or two, got the young actors to age up alongside the characters, even if the trio didn't really look 17 in the last film, it still wasn't that far off. Sure, the adaptations themselves kind of left a lot to be desired, but each and every film in this series performed well, both critically and financially. Just about everyone you talk to will have a different favorite Harry Potter movie, which is a huge achievement in and of itself. And when you look at the box office, the numbers really speak for themselves. $9.5 billion worldwide, just about each movie making more than the last one did. And then we have Fantastic Beasts. For as big of a fan of Harry Potter that I am, I think I'm equally as big of a hater towards the Fantastic Beasts movies. If you have Newt Scamander as the protagonist, and the title of the series is Fantastic Beasts, then why is the series about Dumbledore versus Grindelwald? Doesn't make sense, never made sense, but that, again, is a topic for another time. I think we're all well aware that HBO is making a new Harry Potter series. The cast has yet to be announced. There's a lot of people rumored, and I'll keep my hopes up for a book-accurate story, but I have a feeling more than a lot of people are going to end up being disappointed by this adaptation, and that lightning in a bottle will not be recaptured here. But hey, here's hoping I'm wrong. The most recent franchise breakdown I did was on Lord of the Rings, but of course, the movies as a franchise and a series goes deeper, because when you account the box office, you of course have to include the Hobbit movies too. Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit both follow a member of the Baggins family going on an adventure. One of them destroys this ultra-powerful, possibly world-ending ring, while the other hangs out with some dwarves and takes them back to their house. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are arguably the most successful films on this list. Sure, Harry Potter has made more money than they did, as this series made a mere $5.8 billion, but out of a total of 37 Oscar nominations, The Lord of the Rings won 17 Oscars, including Best Picture for Return of the King. Lord of the Rings has lived on to be one of, if not the greatest trilogy of all time, and also The Hobbit exists too. Personally, The Lord of the Rings is my all-time favorite trilogy. I made a more in-depth video about it. Some people liked it, some people didn't, because I said the extended editions aren't worth all the hype. I think Warner Brothers certainly didn't like the video, considering they demonetized it almost immediately. Speaking of, I'm going to do that YouTuber thing and say if you're enjoying the video, consider checking out some other videos on the channel, becoming a channel member to see videos early and support me in the times that videos do get demonetized. And if you like this video, you like the other videos, hit the subscribe button. It'd be greatly appreciated. Lord of the Rings is in a weird stage right now. I talk about this more in my Lord of the Rings video, but there's obviously the Rings of Power TV show. There was just that recent War of the Rohirrim movie. There's supposedly another live-action Hunt for Gollum movie with cast returning. I don't really know what to think about that, but I think we're on the precipice of seeing a lot more Lord of the Rings movies come out. It's going to become probably something akin to Star Wars or some other franchise that's being milked to death. Hopefully the quality of the movies that they're going to be coming out with will be great and Lord of the Rings will continue doing well, but if they're anything like the recent Lord of the Rings video games, my hopes aren't too high. Last, but certainly not least, we have Game of Thrones. But wait a minute, I thought that this was successful film franchises. And yeah, it mostly is, but it was between picking this and staying in the line with fantasy, or going with Star Wars, which too many people would say is sci-fi instead of fantasy, so Game of Thrones it is. And it's done with great purpose, because out of all these franchises on this list, Game of Thrones might actually be the most successful one. Obviously, it's hard to gauge the numbers between TV shows and movies. Numbers for TV shows aren't as open as movies are, but Game of Thrones was the most popular and most watched TV show of all time by miles. It's also the most pirated show of all time, which means even more people watched it than we know. But Game of Thrones made HBO the most subscribed service by a wide margin and is still, to this day, one of the most watched things on the Max streaming service. Now, I feel like everyone who has watched or even heard Game of Thrones knows what I'm about to say. So I'm just gonna go ahead, get it out of the way. Season 8 was phenomenal.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying?
Now, come on, we all know that Season 8 really ruined the legacy of this series, because if it had stuck the landing, it would probably go down in history as the greatest show of all time. So now I'm going to say something pretty ridiculous. In complete seriousness now, Game of Thrones is still my favorite show of all time. Does it fall off at the end? Yes, it does. But does that take away from the first 4 almost perfect seasons and all the highs of seasons 5, 6, and 7? To me, no, it doesn't. Game of Thrones is also the most award-winning show of all time, with a total of 38 Emmy wins and over 100 nominations. While Game of Thrones isn't a movie, while it isn't young adult, it is still fantasy, it has everything the criteria specified, and it is perhaps the most successful entry on this list. What are some other successful franchises that I left off the list? And since I did it, what are some ultra-successful fantasy TV shows that I didn't cover? If there's enough comments about different franchises, maybe I'll even make a part 2, or one that only centers on TV shows. Special thanks to all my channel members. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more stuff like this. If you do, then I'll see you all in the next one.
Yeah.